Hey everybody, welcome to our next video in control through the purchasing process, and we're going to talk about perishable food items, so food items that are going to go bad, produce, that sort of thing. What we're going to do in this video is show you how to calculate what you need and how much to order. So the first thing you're going to need is your forecast, and don't worry about how we get that forecast. We're going to cover that in a later chapter, right? But it's basically a prediction of the number of customers that are going to come into your restaurant on whatever day or a number of days. The next thing we're going to need to know is the menu mix. And this number is a percentage that through history of what people traditionally buy off of your menu. So if 100 people come into your restaurant, for every 100 people that come in, 10 people order the steak, 10% of the people coming in are going to have steak. So if our numbers, our forecasted numbers are 500, then we're going to expect 10% of those 500 people to order the steak. It's not perfect, but it gives us an idea based on previous buying habits, right? Process for determining our orders differs perishables versus non-perishables, and the non-perishables we'll talk about in the next video, right? So with perishable food items, we want to make sure that we only order enough to get through the next delivery to minimize spoilage, but with a small buffer. So if it's Monday and your next order is coming in on Wednesday, you want to have enough food or perishable items to just get through to Wednesday to your next order, right? You don't want to order green onions for 2 weeks because they're not going to be very nice in 2 weeks, right? So you just want to order enough to get through based on how many customers you're coming in and what business you're going to do, right? You're going to have to take into account what you have on hand already, right? So if we're talking green onions, do we have some in the cooler already that we need to use up first? Obviously, we're not going to order that part again, right? So little formula, our predicted item sales equals our forecasted guest times our menu mix percent. This is that 10% of the customers that come into our restaurant have steak. So if 500 people come in, we expect to have 50 people eating steak, right? So the first example I've got here is a restaurant forecasts 210 guests to come into our restaurant. 7% of the guests usually order the cream of asparagus soup. So how many asparagus soups should the chef expect to sell? So pretty simple, just like my example I gave before, the 10% having steak. We've got 7% of the guests are having this asparagus soup, and we have 210 guests, so we have 210 times 0.07, which gives us 14.7 guests. So we're expecting, out of the 210 people to come in, that roughly 15 guests are going to have asparagus soup, right? So now we need to go in and adjust our recipe so we know how much ingredients we need to make enough asparagus soup for those 15 guests. All right, so in forecasting the dish counts, we always round up. So our answer was 14.7, right? We're always going to round up to 15 because we can't have 0.7 of a person, right? And better to have a little bit too much than not enough, right? We're going to use our standardized recipes to determine the ingredient order quantities from our predicted sales. So if our recipe for asparagus soup makes for 12 portions, we need to adjust that using conversion factor to make it for 15 portions that we have enough asparagus soup, right? In our recipe, we're going to use the yield percentages in that recipe now to determine how much product we need to order. If the recipe says we need 5 pounds of asparagus EP cleaned and trimmed, then we're going to use the yield percentage to determine how much we need to order, right? So our next example here, chef forecasts sales of 15 portions of asparagus soup. Calculate the quantity of ingredients to order using the recipe below. So our recipe says we need 4 pounds of asparagus stems, and our yield is 60%. So we're going to first, our recipe is for 20 portions. We need to convert this recipe by doing the new over the old, right? So new over the old is our conversion factor. So that means our new is 15 out of 20, which means our conversion factor is 0.75, right? So all of our quantities, we're going to multiply times 0.75 times 0.75 times 0.75 times 0.75 times 0.75, right? Our yield percentages are going to stay the same, but our quantity needed, because we don't need to make 20 portions, we only need to make 15, we're going to drop the quantity that we need for this recipe, right? So once we've got that, so 4 pounds times 0.75, our new yield, our new quantity, let's put it over here, is going to be 3 pounds, right? And I'll erase this. And our leeks is going to be, sorry, I got it here. Here, 0.75 pounds. Of course, pretty simple. I just didn't need to just look at my ounces. So 6 ounces, and then we've got 2.25 quarts. And then we have 0.75 quarts, right? So that was just taking our quantity from our original recipe, multiplying times our conversion factor to give us our new quantity, right? Now we need to use the triangle, EP over AP times yield percentage, to determine our quantity that we need to order. Because this is, remember, this here is EP. Now we need to figure out our AP. So if we have 3 pounds of asparagus at a yield percentage of 60%, we do the math and we're going to need to order 5 pounds, right? For our leeks, we have 0.75, 0.75, and our yield percentage is 48%. We're going to divide that out and we're going to need 1.56 pounds to order, right? Remember, our golden rule with EP and AP is that our as purchased always needs to be bigger than our edible portion, right? We need to buy more, then process it and end up with the right amount, okay? And of course, 100% yield on these ones, so these ones here are going to remain the same, okay? And here's the completed chart up above, right? Obviously, with the asparagus stems, we're going to save the tops to use, you know, maybe they're cut with our steak dinner or something like that, right? We're not going to throw them in the garbage, right? A few notes on that, right? Obviously, money saved asparagus stems are used from soup and the tips are used elsewhere. If you've got if you're using your asparagus tips with your steak dish, for example, right? You're going to calculate how many tips you need for both of them, and how many asparagus you need for both recipes. So if the steak says we need 6 pounds of asparagus to order to get enough tips for the number of steaks we're going to sell, we don't need to add another 5 pounds for asparagus soup because we're just going to use the stems from the greater one, right? So what this is saying, this point 2 here is saying, whichever recipe needs the larger quantity and the other part can go to the other one, we're just going to use the greater amount order, right? To make sure we have enough stems for either our steak dish or our soup dish, right? And obviously quantities are always rounded up as a buffer, and then they might even be rounded up because of the pack size or the case size that we can actually buy, right? Ingredient need is not usually the final purchase order, right? It's always going to be a little bit more. So, okay, once we know how much we need for those 15 people for our soup, we need to determine, do we have anything in our cooler still? Do we have any asparagus in our cooler still that we need to use up, right? So we're going to go to our cooler, do an inventory, and see, oh, maybe we have 5 pounds in the cooler already. Well, then we don't need to order any, right? Maybe we have 2 pounds, so we need to order 3 pounds, right? So a little quick formula for that, we're going to take the ingredient needed, in this case our asparagus with 5 pounds, subtract the forecasted amount on hand when the delivery arrives. Now this is important because here's a big differentiation. We're going to take the amount we think is going to be in the cooler when the delivery arrives. So if it's Monday and we're saying we need 5 pounds for our next order, which is Wednesday, is there going to be any asparagus in our cooler come Wednesday, right? There might be 10 pounds in our cooler right now, but it might be all gone by Wednesday, right? So it's not just about how much is in your cooler right now, it's how much is in your cooler when your next delivery arrives, right? Okay, so to summarize all the steps, first we're going to calculate the forecasted ingredient need for the order period, right? Then we're going to calculate the expected inventory that we're going to use between order placement and order receipt. Then we're going to conduct an inventory count. And then we're going to have our inventory we expect to have on hand at delivery. So we're going to figure out how much we actually need to order based on what we think is still going to be in our cooler come the delivery, right? Okay, so one last example. So chef forecasts 170 guests between now and the next delivery arrival. Typically 14% of guests order spinach salad, the only dish using spinach, so we don't have to worry about two different recipes. Our spinach has a yield of 78%, and each salad uses 2 ounces edible portion of spinach per serving. The purchaser is ordering for the following 3-day period to cover 520 forecasted guests, and we have 5 pounds of spinach in the walk-in. So, how much spinach should be ordered? Okay, so the first thing we're going to have to figure out is how much ingredient do we need, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, how many guests? We want to order for 520 forecasted guests. So our ingredient needed is going to be 520 guests times how many of those guests do we expect to have spinach salad? 78%, right? So times 0.78, which is going to give us a total expected number of guests of that's my yield. 14%. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Okay, 0.14, which is going to give us 520 times 0.14 gives us 72.8 guests are going to have a spinach salad. And each one we need 2 ounces of salad for, right? So we're going to multiply that times our 2 ounces to give us a total requirement of 145.6 ounces. Now remember, this is EP. So now we can take our yield percentage and divide by our 0.78 to give us an ingredient needed of 186.7 ounces or 11.67 pounds. Okay. So this is ingredient needed to serve those 520 guests. Okay. The next thing we need to figure out is how much do we think we're going to use between now and the next delivery, right? So I'll change colors here. So my pen will work. So forecast between now and next delivery. Okay. So what are we saying? We have 170 guests are going to come in before the next delivery, right? So we have 170 times our 14% will give us the number of guests that are going to eat the spinach salad, or that we expect to eat the spinach salad. So that means it's 23.8 guests. And I know these are 0.8 of a guest, but we're not going to round our numbers until we get to our final answer here, right? Because there's a little bit of our margin for error. Like we say there's 14% of the guests are going to have spinach salad. You know, it's not always perfect, right? So if we have 23.8 guests times our 2 ounces of EP spinach, we need 47.6 ounces EP, right? So how much AP do we need? We need to divide by our 0.78 yield percentage, which is going to give us an AP amount of 61 ounces. Or if we convert that, it's going to be 3.81 pounds, right? Okay, so the next thing we're going to need is to figure out how much we think we're going to have on hand at delivery. So how much do we have in our cooler? We had 5 pounds, right? So if we had 5 pounds in our cooler right now, and before the next delivery, we expect to use 3.8 pounds, we're going to be left with 1.19 pounds, right? Okay, so now we can figure out how much we need to order. How much do we need to order? Well, we needed this 11.67 pounds of spinach to serve our 520 guests. And we're expected to have 1.19 pounds left in our cooler. So we got 11.67 pounds minus 1.19 pounds equals, punch it into my calculator, we have 10.48 pounds is our order. Now obviously we can't order 10.48, so we're probably going to have to round it up to 11 pounds. Or whatever the next pack size is. Maybe we have to go all the way to 15 pounds because they're 5 pound bags. I don't know. That was something that our purchaser would have to look into. But there's no way we're going down to 10 pounds. Because if we go down to 10 pounds, we're not going to have enough for our 520 guests. Okay. All right, so a couple more points to point out. So using technology, right? The process of calculating order quantities by hand is multiple stepped. I wouldn't call it complicated, but it's, if you follow the steps in the logical order that you're going to be using the product, then it's pretty simple. But if you set up a spreadsheet, an Excel document with these calculations, or put in your yield percentages already and it calculates for you, all you have to do is punch in how much your expected forecast of people is. You have your menu percentage in there, and then it'll calculate out for you, right? And then the computer will calculate preliminary order from the standard recipes and menu mix information, and then the purchaser must deduct the current inventory from our preliminary order, right? So we're going to have to figure out how much is in our cooler to deduct from how much we need, just like we did in this last step, right? The 11.67 pounds is what we needed for our next service period after our next order, and then we had that 1.19 pounds that was in our cooler still, or that we expected to be in our cooler by the time our next order arrived. Okay. So this is how we tackle perishable ingredients, because we want to keep those as fresh as possible. We don't want to order too much. The next video I'm going to talk about is ordering for non-perishable items, things with longer shelf life, canned tomatoes, things like that. So it isn't as critical that we order them bi-weekly or on a shorter period, because they'll last, right? They have a longer shelf life. However, there are some critical points that we want to make sure, though, that we aren't stocking too much, right? All right, I think that's it for this one, and we'll see you on the next one.